Welcome to Ministries the Podcast, where I talk to successful ministry leaders about how they're using podcasting to amplify their mission and grow their ministry so you can too. I'm Tim Hall, your host and owner of Sonomorphic, a podcast production company that specializes in podcasting for ministries. My guest today is Ruth Chou Simons. She's a best-selling and award-winning author of several books and Bible studies, an artist, speaker, the founder of GraceLaced, and the host of the Ruth Chou Simons podcast. Ruth and I are going to talk about how she started her ministry, GraceLaced, why adding video to the podcast was the right next step for the show, and the branding decisions that led to renaming the podcast at the beginning of the year. So let's get right to it. Here's my conversation with Ruth Chou Simons. Well, Ruth, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
It's so good to be here.
Yeah, so I was first introduced to you probably by the She Reads Truth podcast, which is one of the great shows that my production company has the privilege of working on. And I saw that you started GraceLaced podcast about 3.5 years ago in January of 2022. And since that, the podcast has actually changed names, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the show. But the description for your podcast reads, "Some days, all you need is an honest conversation with a friend who's been there. But scheduling a coffee date feels impossible. Join Ruth Chou Simons, best-selling author, artist, and founder of GraceLaced, as she seeks to apply the gospel to her everyday life and help you do the same. Tune in for a coffee date that you didn't have to schedule to chat real life and real application of God's word." So I'm glad to have you on the show today to hear more about your podcasting journey, Ruth. As I was looking on your website and doing some research, I saw that, like several other guests that I've had on the show, you actually got into online content creation by blogging. And I looked back into the archives of the blog and saw that it started probably in July of 2007.
You're good.
And so as you remember back, what got you into blogging?
Oh my goodness, you're good. You did your homework and did some digging. You know what's funny is sometimes I have to actually look back to even figure out what those dates were. But you're right.
Yeah.
The blog started in the throes of little years with kids, and I was a pastor. I'm still a pastor's wife, but at the time we were church planting and founding a school, and we had so much going on. And the long and the short of it is, I had a computer completely crash. I'll just say it's not the same brand of computer I use now, but it was a computer that completely crashed. I lost all these photos of my kids and any little bits of writing that I had done. It just completely was not recoverable. I mean, this is before the cloud, before a lot of things. And I think blogging had just kind of started. I was starting to read about in magazines what is this thing called blogging? And I thought, you know what? It's literally doesn't cost me anything. I might as well start what felt like an online journal. And yet I knew from the start that if I was going to chronicle a little bit of what I was learning and thinking and photos of the kids, that it really wasn't actually a private journal. This is something that was interesting, is that I saw blogging as something where I could do both archive and chronicle the journey, but also do it in a public way where it wasn't just for grandma and it wasn't just a private, photo album. It was actually for me to work out in my own mind and heart in a way that might benefit somebody else, how God's grace is laced through every moment of our day, even if our days don't look the way we expected them to. So for me, I thought I was going to be on the mission field. I thought I was going to do these extraordinary things, had gone to seminary, but actually dropped out halfway through and was like, I'm going to do all these incredible things. And now I was actually sweeping up Cheerios all the time and kind of teaching little boys to share. And does this even matter? Because all I'm doing is sticking to the countertops all day long and folding laundry. And I knew that God had gifted me with a heart and a mind that could process some of this in real time. Or at the end of the day, when the kids went to bed, I was writing and thinking about, how does the gospel matter in my everyday life? And that's how the name GraceLaced came to be, because I was wanting to see how God's grace intersected and laced through my everyday life.
Nice. Yeah. And then after doing that for several years, about 6 years, I think it was, you actually it evolved to a creative business as well. Tell us a little bit about that. And then what led to eventually starting a podcast?
Sure. Yeah, this is your real quick history of my whole ministry and all my work. But, several years in, this thing called Instagram kind of became a thing.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
I remember being on and doing those early filters, Valencia, I was doing some of these early filters and posting some things. And I just remember that at one point I did this challenge. There was a blogging challenge. I don't know if you remember back in the day, people would connect their blogs. So it would be like a
Mm,
series, and they would say, for 30 days, we're all doing something together. And then you would do a blog hop and you would check out everybody's thing. And I did one that my friend Michael Smith was leading at that point, and it was a 30-day challenge. And I chose a topic. She didn't choose it for us. We had to choose our own. And I used the phrase drawing close. And in my mind, I was like, I want to draw close to the Lord and write about that on my blog. But what if I drew something every day? Now, I had
mm,
already been an artist. I already had worked out this desire in my life to use my giftings through art. And so it wasn't like something I'd never done before. I actually got my degree in fine arts. That's a whole other story because it wasn't the plan either. But I wasn't planning on using it professionally. So for me, it was like, let's get the graphite pencils and the watercolors out of storage and start doing something every day. Well, it was easier to stand up from the kitchen table during nap time and take a quick, very basic cell phone picture of it and post it on Instagram and say, this is part of my Drawing Close series over at the blog. Well, wouldn't you know that Instagram posts were really well received because it was a
mm.
microblog. It was a moment where
Sure.
I took an image and then I talked about what I was going to talk about in length over at the blog, and people responded. They said, oh, I'm connecting the visual with the tiny bit that you're writing about it. And yes, the blog still did fine and people still clicked over and read the blog. But what was happening was that people were following the series, they were growing. And then the number of people who were watching were growing, but they also were like, this is interesting. She's drawing something or painting something every day and adding on a devotional thought, something that was causing her to like grow as she's meditating on the word or meditating on something she's thinking about as she's painting. And so, of course, a few comments came in. Could we buy that? Is that something you could put for sale? And at that point in 2013, I already had 6 boys. My sixth was really tiny. He was fairly newborn, but my oldest was 11 and super responsible and super helpful. And for 11 years, I had, blogged instead of watching TV at night,
Hmm.
but had never done anything e-commerce, not any substantial way. I just really sensed that the Lord was like, this is the time, go ahead. I wasn't giving my full-time attention to it, but it was an opportunity to say, okay, I have more things in place with the boys. I can use nap times and after bedtimes to do this. And so in 2013, I started the e-commerce side of GraceLaced. The blog was still going, but we turned one part of GraceLaced to an e-commerce. Well, the rest is history because, it took, I think, a while for it to catch on. And I was still drawing and writing my own little addresses and labels.
Mm.
And I was still decorating every package. And within 2 years, I was like, okay, this is something I need help with. I need to hire some folks to help me. I wasn't interested in going big suddenly or anything like that, but I just knew that to steward the opportunity well, I needed to just kind of give it a little bit more intention. So some first employees were hired then. But as you said, a couple years ago, the podcast started. And, what was happening during that time was, we were post COVID, as a lot of e-commerce sites felt, we assumed that everything was going to really impact us poorly, but we
Mm.
actually boomed during COVID. E-commerce had such a lift and we experienced the fastest growth we'd experienced
Mm.
ever probably
Yeah.
during those 2 years because people were home, they weren't going on vacations, there was money to spend on things that would encourage them. And so it was really a substantial time for GraceLaced. And we started thinking through how could we, again, I use this word steward, I said it earlier, how could I steward this opportunity? And at the time I thought, well, it doesn't cost us hardly anything to podcast. I'll be honest, I really feel like I'm an accidental podcaster because I wasn't trying to start a podcast. I wasn't trying to start a whole new avenue, not for revenue even or anything like that. It was truly just that there's this platform that we could use and it's not going to be super expensive. We've got some people on the team who can help edit it. And in my mind, I thought, well, it was an opportunity for us to do what we used to do on the blog, talk about what the heart behind products, the heart behind why I create, and just put that in a podcast form because people are listening and they're
Yeah.
home and they're able to do so. And so initially, I wasn't even going to be on the podcast. It was going to be a brand podcast. It was a
Okay.
podcast for
Yeah.
GraceLaced. And remember, that was a time when GraceLaced was kind of exponentially growing at a really fast rate. So in our minds, we were like, wow, GraceLaced can really become, you know, in time an app, a membership. We could do a whole full blown ministry. The podcast can really be sustained as a GraceLaced brand podcast to help support this business, this ministry that's fueled by a retail. That's really
Hmm.
how my mind thought of the whole
Yeah.
thing.
Okay.
But right before we launched, I realized, you know, I don't know that that's where we're at. And I could tell because post 2021, everybody was like still reeling from all this growth. But what we noticed was the sales were declining, not because we were not popular, but because life was changing. Supply chains got really hard. E-commerce was actually suffering and has continued to suffer since 2021. And so we've actually found ourselves pivoting and saying, oh my goodness, it's not actually this escalating growth situation. We actually are tapering off and at some levels declining and having to reconsider what has God actually called us to? And what I realized during that season was it wasn't that it's a podcast about the products or that no one else on the team could carry the messaging yet unless we grew further. So
Mm.
I and my executive director at that time came on and we said, let's have a conversation. We knew that we were not going to be a primarily interview based podcast. I, as an author, am booked regularly for podcasts and I'm interviewed about my books or I'm interviewed
Yeah.
about things that I'm doing. But I knew GraceLaced podcast was not going to be on the circuit to interview other authors or do current events. It was really just a conversation that I wanted to have that felt like the blog.
Mm.
So I think you noticed all those things as you did your research, but yeah, that was really the heart behind it, was actually a way to give a nod to the heart behind the products and the heart behind the resources we were creating. And because all the products and the resources were based on my writings and my paintings, we knew that I still had to be at the center of the GraceLaced podcast when we first started.
Yeah. So what was attractive about podcasting specifically you've been doing the blog for so long and then, hey, let's start a podcast. And there was kind of a handoff there. I saw that
Yeah.
the blog kind of tapered off in
Mhm.
2022 when the podcast began. What was attractive about that switch for you?
Yeah. So for me personally, because I was writing books and I've kept on a pretty steady pace because I have so many genres of books. So
Hmm.
I'm pretty heavily published because I don't stay in one genre. And so it feels like I pretty much regularly have one genre come out right after a different
Yeah.
genre. And so I'm at a pretty consistent pace in writing. And that kept me from being able to just leisurely write for a blog. And
Sure.
we could have changed that. We could have figured out the paradigm and said, okay, hey, GraceLaced blog is going to be only contributor based. But that required a whole other set of
Yeah.
requirements and vetting and personnel. And so if I wasn't going to write and I couldn't write for the blog, what I could give was honest conversations. What I could
Hmm.
do was to process in a way that I already was with my team. My team and I were already talking about how God was working in our lives, why that verse matters, why we're doing this product. Why do we talk about preparing him room at Christmas? Like, why not turn that into a podcast episode or series? And so, and also, blogging has come and gone. There's been a resurgence,
Hmm.
but honestly, there was a season where everybody had their headphones in and people were either working from home or if they had a commute, they said, okay, I can listen to that and I can grow there.
Totally. Yeah. So, what were some of those challenges that you faced as you started getting into podcasting? You hadn't been doing it before. You've been doing the blog, you've been doing all these other products, but then you're getting into this audio field of things. What were some of the challenges that you ended up facing and how did you overcome them?
Well, first and foremost, I'd say I wasn't a heavy podcast listener.
Okay.
So, not being somebody who was listening to podcasts a lot, the whole thing felt new to me. And
Mm.
being a bit of a perfectionist, as well as somebody who's produces books and products that are all edited for
Hmm.
20,000 rounds or whatever it is, we're like, by the time you get a book, we've like worked on it for 2 years, It was a lot for somebody like me to get in front of a mic with a script that I didn't want to read, but, like not a full blown script, but an outline, and
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
really challenge myself. And I'm not going to say, I don't feel like I'm not a good communicator, but this like processing verbally is not where I'm most eloquent. It really is not. And so I actually find that I'm when they say there's authors who speak or speakers who write, I'm
Mm,
absolutely an author who kind of reluctantly speaks, right? And so
gotcha.
I'm somebody who needs to be behind the computer, typing away, editing, thinking, slow thoughts. So this format's actually really hard for me. I mean, I compensate by moving my hands. I know you can't see this on a podcast, but I'm like really trying to think on the go. And I've obviously had some practice now over
Yeah,
the
yeah,
years,
yeah.
but it was such a challenge. It was challenge for our team, but our team, I have a son at the time who hadn't graduated yet and he loved to do editing. So it was
Nice.
helpful to have somebody in-house
Yeah,
who was
yeah.
like, I can edit, I can do this. And so we're not networked at that point. We were not trying to be fancy. We were, I think, occasionally just doing a nod to our own business and a few times maybe willing to do a shout out or do a
Mhm.
sponsored post, but we were not selling ads, nothing like that.
Yeah. So fast forward a few years after the podcast starts, get to the beginning of this year and you actually changed the name for the podcast, which I alluded to at the beginning of the show. So I'd love to talk through that a little bit. What made you decide to change from the GraceLaced podcast to the Ruth Cho Simons podcast back in January?
So, first of all, I'll just say, as a reminder, I really continue to feel like an accidental podcaster. So, I actually didn't even think we were going to keep on going forever. I thought, let's just try this out. It doesn't cost us
Yeah.
much. We have
Yeah.
people in house. So, when we hit 1 million downloads early spring of 24, so not in 25, but like a year ago this spring,
Yeah.
we were like, wait, people really, I mean, we were tracking, we
This
were
is doing
tracking our
something.
downloads. It's not that we were not tracking, but we were
Yeah. Yeah.
realizing, hey, we'd been tapped a few times by networks. We'd been asked, hey,
Mm,
do you, can we sell you ads? And we knew what good downloads looked like, but we weren't trying to leverage anything. We were just trying to be good
mm.
stewards of like the time that we had, the resources we had, a platform that could help us expand in ways that didn't require TikTok for me. And so I was like, okay, well, so when we hit 1 million downloads, I was like, I think people are actually listening, even with my awkward, I don't know what to say next, even with me not being perfect and edited, all those things. And to be honest, and I think this is only helpful in a conversation like this, if we can be super honest, because I want to help anyone else in ministry trying to think through this. I think about 10 years in with, 6, 7 years in with publishing, almost 10 years in with the e-commerce, I think I was going through a bit of an identity crisis. I think
Mm,
I genuinely was like, I've got two whole things going. I have 4 jobs and two whole ministries that are together and separate. They're separate because GraceLaced doesn't write the books, but
right. Right.
also GraceLaced is a retail e-commerce lifestyle brand that's not books. And I really had like some struggle over this. I
Mm,
had a struggle with the thought that we had tried a membership site and it really didn't quite work because Grace Laced was not Beth Moore's Living Proof Ministries. It was not a 501c3. It wasn't some big ministry where we were constantly growing by bringing people into support, or it was a lifestyle brand. And I could continue to grow that. There's no end to growing that. But while I was stewarding authoring, I was realizing I'm at the helm. It's because I'm the artist that Grace Laced grows and does well. But I really couldn't separate the two fully and just, run only in one lane and let the other one do by itself. And so we took a long pause. I don't know if you noticed
mm.
that, but we took a
Yeah. Yeah.
very long pause where there was no podcasting. I just rested because I was in between multiple writing projects. And I really just kind of did a heart check and talked to the Lord about how do I steward this? I am one person with 24 hours a day and I really need 8 hours of sleep. So how do we do this well? And I still have kids at home. My youngest is 12 right now. I need to steward these years where I still have teenagers at home. My husband is a preaching pastor. Like, we've got to think about how to do this well. And so, what I really ultimately came to was what people are listening to is not a brand that is growing or scaling or becoming widely distributed. What they're listening to is the heart of a woman who is an artist and an author and is doing her best with her hands going wild, talking about what is the heart behind why she creates or writes
Mm,
anyway, and what she's learning as she's raising 6 boys and as she's married for 20 some years and as she is involved in the local church. And so The heart behind changing it really was just to help us steward well the fact that both things were going to keep on going.
Hmm.
We couldn't try to blend them and hope to have really good results. And so
Mm,
fundamentally, we said, let GraceLaced just be a really wonderful retail e-commerce site where Ruth's art shines. And then Ruth's message and her voice gets brought in under the umbrella of Ruth Joe Simon's ministries. Like that's what I'm really, everything else, even GraceLaced is brought under what Ruth does overall, not the other way
sure.
around. So I hope
Yeah.
that makes
Yeah.
sense on a branding
Totally.
level.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's good that you to explain all of that and just to think through that as ministry leaders of how it's progressing throughout and what makes the most sense for the next step. And yeah,
And being
you
willing to
you could
pivot, you know, being
exactly. Yeah,
willing
you
to
could
make a change.
yeah, because you could very well end up with I was started doing this and then I added this and then how do they come together? And you have to think through all those things. And so it sounds like you did a great job discerning that and coming to a good spot with rebranding the podcast and having both of those live in really good lanes. So I'd love to hear too about some of the opportunities that have come up throughout these several years, specifically over the time that you've been podcasting. What are some opportunities that have come up that you don't know as you would have had otherwise if you didn't have a podcast?
You know, one of the things that I love most is that now when I speak at events and at women's conferences, and there's a book signing line and women are lined up and they come and meet me, I hear so often now, oh, I've been listening to your podcast.
Mm,
It's like listening, now that I'm talking to you, it's like I already know you because that's really, I would say, my number one reason right now for podcasting is because I don't want anyone to ever only experience the perfectly curated Instagram
mm,
post or
yeah.
the perfectly edited book, because the real woman behind that book that is perfectly edited and gorgeous is messy and awkward, and English is her second language. And there's a lot going on in my life that I can't always explain unless I just have a face to face encounter. And the reality is, I think I'm better in an intimate and more personal setting. I don't think I'm meant for the stage. And I don't think I'm necessarily some person who wants a lot of distance. By necessity, I have distance. But my point is, when somebody meets me and says, I know your voice, I think that's the best thing. That's the best thing
Mm,
in the world when
yeah.
someone in the moments where they're discouraged have heard me awkwardly share something and they felt encouraged. Well, now I feel like, okay, the best we can do on this side of eternity is to use a medium like podcasting where somebody's voice and their heart and their tone and maybe even their vulnerability comes through, because you can't always read that, but you can hear it.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's the great thing about the medium of podcasting is just the ability to build trust with people just because they're spending time with your voice, right? Like that's
Mhm.
just such a cool thing. Yeah, the written word is great. And so you can take it wherever you want with you. So you can do the same thing with podcasts, but there's something different about hearing somebody's voice at the same time, conveying a message with that emotion. It comes across differently and in different ways. But that's really cool. So I'd love to hear about your upcoming book here that's coming out in October called The Way of the Wildflower. And I'd love to hear too how podcasting has evolved, how that medium as well as the writing kind of goes together. What are some ways that those overlap? And tell us about the new book.
Yeah, thank you. This is one of my full color books. So I write trade books where there's not art really in it. I write Bible studies, but this one, every couple of years, I get to do a full color. I mean, it's like I write the book and then I paint the book. So the
Mm,
entire book is full of artwork. It really is meant to, whether you use it as a devotional or a Bible study, it's meant for you to kind of read slowly. They're like meditations to help you like really linger long day by day. And one of the things that I think is really exciting about writing somewhat more like devotional content, or in this case, gospel meditations to
hmm.
unburden your anxious soul is my subtitle. I
Yeah.
think a lot of the way I write in a book like this is born out of even doing episodes on my podcast. This summer, I've been doing a Fruit of the Spirit series where I curated for each of the fruit of the Spirit. So, love, all the verses that I curated together. I read the verses about love, and then I explained and talked about it and applied it at the end. They were really short episodes, but for whatever reason, it really resonated with people.
Mm,
And I think it's because a lot of times we can be in our Bible reading plan, or maybe you're going through a dry spell and you're not actually in the Word. But when somebody helps you hear the word in a different way or read the
Yeah.
word and experience it beautifully because there's beautiful art on the page that help you linger long. I think both mediums actually help you pause. And I think sometimes we don't pause in the written word when there's no embellishment or no beauty. But when you
Mm,
listen, you pause and you go, okay. And then you're hearing somebody share how to apply it. And that's literally what I do in this book. And so no, none of the writing is directly from anything I've podcasted specifically. It's not that we turn any podcasts
yeah.
into
Yeah.
the book, but I think anyone who's listened to my podcast will go, oh, this is basically another form
Hmm.
of hearing her heart. And the same insights that she gives on the podcast, I now have at my fingertips through a book, or vice versa. If somebody really loves my book, I would say, hey, the same kind of application of God's word can be found in a 20-minute episode or a 12-minute episode. And so the goals are so similar.
Nice. Yeah. And I think I saw on Instagram too that you did an audiobook of it as
I
well. And so if
did.
people love hearing your voice from the podcast, it's super easy to also go over there and have that same experience. Tell me a little bit about the audiobook recording process.
Well, I've done several. So now I'm
Yeah.
actually, I won't call myself a pro because I still struggle with all sorts of things. And for whatever reason, cannot enunciate when you're sitting there trying to read your book. But I'm actually a pretty, like they always say, you get it done in almost like
Mm,
basically a one long day. So I actually am pretty efficient, but I really enjoy it because I think it helps me. Well, it's one of the few times I actually read my books cover
mm,
to cover and praise God when you love your book at the end of it.
yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
always been the case. I've found typos before. I've seen things where I'm like, I should have said that a different way. But in The Way of the Wildflower, it was really special because the whole book is 30 meditations about different scenarios in which we feel anxious and worried. So whether it's when you don't know what to do next, or when you're afraid of the future, or when community is hard, or when you feel alone, or when you don't feel lovely, or when you want what you don't have. Those are pretty honest things that we all feel, but maybe you don't expect to read a whole entry about. But I actually, living here in Western Colorado, the wildflowers are all abloom right now, as
Hmm.
in
Yeah.
the time of this recording. And I observe how free they are. I observe how dependent they are. And of course, that is a picture of exactly what Jesus says in Luke
Yeah.
12:27. Consider how the wildflower grows. They don't toil or spin. And he says this in the Sermon on the Mount. And he's basically saying, don't worry because look how I take care of the wildflowers.
Hmm.
And so I pair wildflowers, individual, all 30 different flowers and species, and I combine a little study of them with
Nice.
how we can look to God's word to be unburdened in each of these scenarios. So it was really good to come to the end of it.
Yeah.
And I actually told my team, I said, I'm done with the audiobook and I feel quite convicted in the best ways. I was
Hmm.
like, I forgot that I said that, but I needed it right now. So it was really good.
All right, I'd love to jump into some of the technical and production side of podcasting here for a minute. And the first thing I would love to ask you about is with the rebrand of the podcast, I saw that you joined the Access More network. And so I'd love to hear what's been the advantage of joining a podcast network?
Our heart for it was initially because we were doing a little bit of restructuring. And truth be told, I think in small business, you're always doing some of that because, life things change and
Yeah,
resources
yeah,
change. And so at the time, we were needing to take some energy away from producing this podcast and have some help with it. And so it made a big difference to have someone else come along and say, hey, we'll edit, we'll clip, we'll do the other things. And Access More, having been the network for several of my favorite people and
yeah,
trusted podcasts, made a difference. And we just had a relationship with them that had been ongoing. And, there's been some changes with how various networks can do ads or no ads. And so I would
yeah,
just say we're in the process of even just really experiencing the blessings of a partnership, but also constantly going, we're looking at what the future might hold
sure.
for both them and us. And so it's a pretty new partnership, but it's been so sweet because of the heart behind the network. Like their heart is really the ministry of their listeners. Ultimately, it's not to sell ads. It's ultimately to kind of serve their listeners. And so it's been a new and really great partnership so far, but it's new to
Nice.
us. And so
Yeah.
that's, I think we're only 12 episodes
Hmm.
in that partnership. So we're still learning, we're still
Yeah.
growing. And honestly, when you're a small team that's so used to doing everything on your own, there's
Yeah.
some things that you have to work out as you work
For
out those
sure.
kinds of things. So yeah, that's new for us because that means that the episodes now also live on their network. And so that's a
Right.
really big change for us to be really those particular episodes to be the ones that are really reaching their audience and stuff. So that's been a neat part of a change in
Yeah.
25.
Nice. Yeah, and let's hear a little bit too about the production process. You were talking about the editing, the post production, the clips, all of the things that go around that. Tell us a little bit about what your process looks like and how that works as well with the network and where that handoff is. I'd love to hear a little bit of behind the scenes for people that are interested to know kind of how the podcast ticks.
Well, the funny thing is I had to read your question and go ask my people how this works because I'm not the one that does that. So I really was
Sure.
like, he's going to ask me this question. I actually don't remember how we do these things. Before we actually joined the network,
Yeah.
we did everything in-house. So we
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
a wonderful gal who is got her fingers in so much of what I do that she knows all things. And so she actually learned how to get this
Mm,
done. And so,
nice.
we record on Zencaster and then we would edit and then we would clip for because my platform of choice primarily is Instagram. So
Sure.
we
Yeah.
have to think about reels and
Yeah.
all
Hmm.
those things. And so I would have my executive director pull really pertinent clips and then we would turn those into carousels. You do
Hmm.
one piece of content and you make it work for you in multiple areas. And
Yeah.
so as I said, my oldest is still quite the techie. He's a videographer. He's good at all those things. He
Nice.
now is also a mechanical engineer and a nice job. I mean, he graduated from grad school. So he's not doing this for us anymore. But at the time, he hadn't graduated from graduate school and was able to do all these things and stuff. So we had a pretty tight in-house team since then because we have an in-house graphic designer. We have in-house people who were already doing other things of similar kind for the
Yeah.
brand.
Hmm.
So it was
Sure.
an easy transition for us to do something like this. Now we really get to just upload the file,
Mm,
send it over to the network. And I say that carefully because every network and every client or every partnership, it looks different. Not everyone edits or not everyone creates, that's a negotiated situation, but in our
right.
case, we really said, hey, part of this partnership is that we need to offload some of these tasks. We need some help with these things. And we even want some help ideating or stewarding how to create assets from this content and stuff. So we're working on that currently. So right now, my team does a lot less than they did a year ago.
Yeah, allows you to freeze you up to be able to
Mhm.
just record the thing and then it all happens. And your team is freed up to work on other things that they need to focus on. So that's really cool that that's working well. And then I'd love to know too. So as I was looking through the podcast on YouTube, I noticed that around the same time that you rebranded the podcast, you also switched microphones. And so for those that care about the microphone side of things, I'd love to know what was behind the decision to change from the Shure MV7 to the Rode pod mic that you're now using.
It was so funny to read your question because I was like, I actually didn't realize we had done that. And I was like, hey, team, did we actually do that? I mean, he's good. He noticed them. I was like, I don't think I know about our microphones. And I actually now remember. So I have a home office
Yeah.
from which I had done a lot of recording in the past because I'm sitting currently in a studio that was only completed last March. So we have now on the property a barn that got converted into a very state of the art, very nice HQ for
Nice.
all things
Yeah.
that I do with GraceLaced and Ruth Joe Simons. And within this facility, we actually built a sound friendly studio for all things recording because I was like, if I'm going to do this thing, let's have the space for it
Right.
rather than
Yeah.
constantly telling the kids, hey, I'm on air.
Right. Yeah.
So I think the change was actually that the Shure mic had a little tripod that moved with me to the home office. So
Mm,
when we need to do something from another
yeah.
location, that's the one we take. But also, usually it's a solo show. And so I liked the way this one looked. I think somebody maybe
Yeah.
asked me at one point, which one do you want to have on air? And I said, oh, I like the way this one looks. And they said,
Yeah.
okay. So I think it wasn't really a super techie reason. It was more just aesthetics, I think. Maybe I
Yeah.
think that's why.
No, that's great. Yeah, they're both great mics. So I was just curious on what made you
I
change.
love it.
And
I
so,
love
yeah, it
that you
sounds
know.
like it was just the necessity of the set change and needing that mic in a different location. And the MV7 is easy to just plug straight into your computer
Yeah.
as well. So that makes it easy to use in different spaces. Yeah, along those lines. So as I was saying, I was looking on YouTube. I noticed that you now do the podcast in full video, and you have been for several, I think about a year. I think I saw. And
Almost. Yeah.
so, yeah, tell me a little bit about the decision to invest in. You've been recording the audio for 2-ish years, roughly,
Hmm.
and then you decided, hey, let's take this full video and create the set that you're now sitting in, and all of that went along with it, and investing in the video side of podcasting.
Well, with Instagram Reels, you have to have video
Mm-hmm.
anyway. And
Right.
it doesn't always work to just have voiceover, some kind of B
Mm-hmm.
roll. And so we were
Yeah.
already trying to pull this like clip from Zencaster video, and it doesn't always look good. And it's like so close up. And because with GraceLaced, we have really nice Sony cameras. I think we have like
Mm-hmm.
3 of them and really nice lenses because we had, and she's gone on maternity leave, but we had an in-house photographer who
Yeah.
does all the photos you see for
Mm-hmm.
GraceLaced. And so we just had this equipment sitting here. And we basically were like, well, we can absolutely do a better job of videoing if we just assign one of those cameras
Yeah.
onto a,
Sure.
hardcore tripod and what it requires. And the studio I'm sitting in, we've got 2, we've got this, I don't even know what they're called. We've got a fancy balloon light over on the right, and we have another light on the left. And it takes a little bit more to do it. And it
Right.
takes setup and it takes a special lens. But I think what I love about it is number one, from this, we can actually do clips for social assets a lot easier without
Yeah.
worrying about, ooh, is this the right time of day? Is the light good? Or
Mm-hmm.
can we pull it from Zencaster? But then secondly, I think it's 3 parts. So it's that I'm on a ton of interviews because
Mm-hmm.
if I have a book coming out every year or every other year, that is an entire press tour that I'm doing
Right.
where I'm on potentially 40 podcasts, and I want to give the best quality to the podcast I'm on. And so this is also really helpful for me to just walk on over and nothing moves. The set is set up
That's
all the
great.
time.
Yeah.
So that really helped me out. And then thirdly, I would say if I had a choice between YouTube video or a podcast, if I had to choose, I'd actually probably choose YouTube, not because I love being on camera, but because I feel like somebody can get a little bit more of my heart by
Mm.
watching me talk while I'm talking.
Sure.
Because, like I said
Yeah.
earlier, I don't feel the most eloquent on podcasts. I'm kind of reluctant to like sit there and, talk into a microphone. However, I'm really grateful you can marry the two. And so there
Mm-hmm.
are people who I don't promote YouTube. I'm not doing much with YouTube, but we figure if it doesn't take that much effort to
Mm-hmm.
put the entire recording on the YouTube channel, it just is an opportunity for people to access that, to serve those who might feel connected by watching. But
Sure.
also, I think it's also been so I guess this is a fourth reason. I get booked to speak quite often because of my career. I'm speaking at different events or conferences several times a month. And so it's an opportunity for somebody who, before they book me, to say,
Mm-hmm.
who is she and what is she
Yeah.
like and how does she talk? And, just have that kind of more intimate experience of knowing who I am.
Yeah. Back when I used to work at Ramsey Solutions and book guests for the Entre Leadership podcast, we would do the same thing. As we were looking to book new guests, we'd go to YouTube and search their name. And so, it's super helpful to go on there and be like, oh yeah, this is how she speaks. She looked very genuine. Like all of those kind of things are very
Exactly.
easy to see when you can not only hear but also see the hand movements, all of that kind of stuff. See the smile. So as you look back on your 3+ years in podcasting, how has the podcast helped you amplify your mission and grow your ministry?
I think it helps me recognize that you have to use what's available.
Mm.
Like, you didn't ask this, but I'm turning 50 this year. I am not really like with all the young Gen Zers or Gen Alphas running real fast. I'm running real slow these days. Like, I'm starting to feel this sense of like, when can I retire? I'm really just joking. Like, I'm not about to slow things down,
Yeah.
but just by necessity, just by changing seasons in life, just by having adult children and hopefully grandchildren in the next 10 years, like my season's changing and I can't just suddenly go and do a whole TikTok channel full of trending audio and videos. So keeping up doesn't look like that for me. I'm not about to do a whole bunch of highly produced POV videos all the time just to get followers on social media. But I can use what's available. And what's available is podcasting. What's available is YouTube. What's available is already this mic and my time. And if I'm already going to process some of this content that I'm thinking about for
Yeah.
my books, I might as well say it out loud for somebody else to be encouraged. And so I think for me, it's a bit of a challenge. Well, it already really is a challenge, but I would say it's just a form of accountability for myself to remember that the ministry that I'm in is not just so that I can produce products or produce books or just kind of create beyond the production end of things, but to actually serve people with heart and message. And it's just a reminder that the whole package matters and people need more than one avenue to hear and understand the word of God.
Nice. Yeah. So, as we come to the close of our interview, what are you most excited about for the future of the Ruth Cho Simons podcast and your ministry?
I really do desire to grow in a way where ultimately people who hear my voice, watch the videos, read my books, might even come to an in person retreat. I would really love to take that one step further and get more personal in ways where I feel like I have a lot to offer on a small group setting or, just not a 10,000 women event. It feels like an elite retreat is something where I can give more content and give more coaching in a way that actually matters. And so that feels still a long ways off. It feels like it takes a lot and I'm still trying to steward what I've already been given. But I feel like that feels like a natural outworking of what has really compelled me to stay podcasting, to stay on YouTube, to stay doing what I'm doing. On a personal level, I would say maybe pivot your question a little bit and say what I'm looking most forward to on a personal level is to grow in this. I don't
Mm.
plan on quitting, but I also find that it's really a challenge and it really keeps you because I can't fake it. I can't make up a bunch of things to say. I can't say the same thing over and over again and expect it to sound new. It really is a challenge for me to remember. My husband likes to say it this way. He says, you just have to keep reading if you hope to have anything to share with the world. He reminds me all the time, like, you won't have anything to write if you're not constantly soaking in more growth yourself. And so it's a challenge to myself as a podcaster to have everything I say on my podcast be an overflow of a life that actually has a lot of input. And so when I sit in the studio and I get behind the mic, it's a convicting moment where I realize, like, I can't just open my mouth and have something brilliant to say or have something compelling to say unless I've been filled up first. So if that means I need to be in the
Yeah.
Word, if that means I have to read my Bible and study and think more and journal more and go read books more, have better conversations before I ever show up, I need to do that. So that's what I'm looking forward to, is actually growing in that way.
Nice. Yeah. All right. Well, let's jump into the high pass segment here where we ignore the lows and I ask you about some of your favorite things. So, the first question in the segment is, what's one of your favorite activities to do as a family?
Oh, that's easy. For sure. It's been a learned thing for me, but I love going jeeping with my boys. So for anyone who
Mm.
doesn't know what that is, it's just going off-roading. We don't actually ride in a Jeep, but our vehicles are four-wheel. Remember, we live in the mountains of
Yeah, yeah,
Colorado. And so because I spend my days with 7 males that belong to my family, we do a lot of off-roading and hiking and getting up into the alpine lakes. And it's really my favorite thing.
Yeah, nice. All right, I saw in the fun facts on your website that you can't stop eating salt and vinegar chips. So I'm interested as a fellow salt and vinegar chip lover. What's your favorite brand of salt and vinegar chips?
I think currently it's Kettle. I think
Okay, yeah, I
currently, but
agree.
but at the airport it's Vicky's because,
Sure.
you can't get it. So you're gonna
hmm
Vicky's isn't bad either.
Yep, yep, that's great. All right, what's one of your favorite stories from a listener about how the podcast has impacted their life?
I touched on this earlier, but I think one of my favorite times was when I thought I was failing at podcasting. I
Mm,
literally was like, oh, it's so I feel like I'm dull. It's boring. I don't know if I'm doing a good job. And I remember being at an event and a woman coming up to me and just tears streaming down her face. And she
Mm.
said, I listened to that episode, the one that I thought was maybe not that great. She said, I listened to it 3 times and it made such a difference in my life. And the funny thing is, that's actually been said of one of my most embarrassing episodes. I don't know if you happen to know about this one, but one time when we were still in house and doing things, we're human, mistakes happen.
Yeah.
And we uploaded a version of the entire podcast recording without the front and the back clipped out. So
Mm.
it had me yelling, I'm done. Or was that good? I think that really stunk. Like I literally had all the stuff
Yeah.
you really hope to cut out was left in. And
Mm.
I probably was the color of my shirt, like lavender, like
Mm.
literally pale for like a day. And I thought, oh my
Mm.
goodness, this is failure. This is failure. But then I actually ended up doing a episode talking about what to do when you feel like you fail at something, when it doesn't go
Mm.
your way. Because our team grew together. Nobody got fired. It was like lovely to like work through grace and work through what it looks
Mm.
like to work through these things. And I got more comments about that and people saying,
Mm.
thanks so much for sharing vulnerably mistakes and things that would cause you embarrassment. And so
Yeah.
those are 2 stories I remember a
Mm.
lot.
Yeah. All right. Well, as we close, Ruth, who else do you think would be a great guest for this podcast?
Well, I think you should talk to my friend Jen Wilkin, who has grown a lot
Yeah.
in podcasting. She somehow, while I was not paying super close attention, her Knowing Faith podcast with her
Yeah.
2 co-hosts has really taken off and has even become an entire branded end of her ministry. And
Yeah. Yeah.
so I'm really proud of her. And she's a great communicator. I mean, she's a great
Mm-hmm.
speaker, great Bible
Yeah.
teacher. I'd be curious to hear her answers to all these things about podcasting as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, I'd love to have Jen on. That would be a great conversation. So, Ruth, thanks again for taking the time to be on the podcast today. I really enjoyed hearing about your journey.
Thanks so much for having me.
It was great to talk with Ruth about her podcasting journey of going from blogging to starting a creative business to writing best-selling books to podcasting, and then further defining the brand strategy that led to renaming the podcast. You can listen to the Ruth Chou Simons podcast with the link in the show notes. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Ministries That Podcast, produced by Sonomorphic. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure you follow or subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend. That's the best way to support this show, and together we'll help more ministries grow and thrive through podcasting. Now come back in 2 weeks to hear my conversation with Amy Gannett. She's the founder and creator of Tiny Theologians, where she offers training tools that will help parents and children's ministries pass on the Christian faith, and the creator of the podcast, Tiny Theologians. We're going to talk about the story of starting the ministry and later the podcast, the inspiration behind their unique podcast format, and what it takes to create an episode of a scripted podcast with voice actors. Well, until next time, keep encouraging your audience as they follow Jesus.